At the end of the 19th century, Victorian society was experiencing an identity crisis. And you know what that means? Monsters. All monsters blur the boundaries between what is considered us and what is considered them. People are always writing stories about different kinds of monsters, but most of them don't catch on because they just don't resonate. The ones that do catch on are the ones that come closest to the embodiment of our doubts and fears about ourselves. Many of the monsters that caught on in the 19th century blurred the boundaries between man and beast, like Mr. Hyde in Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Of course, there was the werewolf, which made several literary appearances. Monsters like these always turn up when we begin to wonder if there is any real difference between humans and animals. I don't think we will ever be rid of these kinds of monsters. Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species challenged the idea that human beings were a special creation of God. It said that humans are essentially animals. The boundary between that which is us, humans, and that which is not us, animals, was put into doubt. So the fence around our identity was weak at that point, the place in the fence that differentiates us from animals. So the monsters that resonated were the ones that embodied the blurring of that particular boundary, Mr. Hyde and the Wolfman, the particular monsters that embodied the Victorian doubts and fears about their identity. And then came the vampire. The England of Bram Stoker's Dracula, what we call the late Victorian era, had experienced a lot of change. One could even say upheaval. People were abandoning faith in the Christian God for a faith in reason. Applied reason led to great advances in science and technology. Steam took people across continents and oceans. Machines and factories were changing the social and natural landscapes. Growing economies created wealth, and the new middle class was growing. The New Woman, a feminist ideal that emerged at this time, had women marching in the streets demanding the vote and other rights. And there was some worry about the different kinds of people immigrating to the motherland from the colonies. And there was, of course, Darwin's book. Despite all this, there was a lot of optimism during the Victorian era, but some writers and thinkers weren't so sure. For one thing, there was a dark side to all this progress. The new economies favored industry over agriculture, so huge numbers of rural workers moved to the city seeking work in factories. The cities lacked proper housing and infrastructure. Consequently, the majority of the working class lived in squalor. With all this upheaval, it's no wonder that the Victorian identity was under threat. This led to a very interesting and complex monster. The popularity of the vampire, particularly Bram Stoker's Dracula, gives us some idea as to the nature of the threat to the Victorian collective identity. The English still believed in an ordered and predictable universe, but they were coming to believe that the universe was material, that everything had a physical explanation, and so it all could be understood with reason, which presupposes an ordered universe, one that you can make sense of with reason. Although some thinkers had abandoned the idea of an ordered universe, at a popular level people still believed that the world could be understood by clear categories. Already you can see the potential problem with holding on to both materialism and a rational universe. If there isn't anything outside the material world, like the cosmos or God, on what do these categories hang? English society and the Victorian identity was built upon the existence of categories like animal, human, male, female, civilized, uncivilized. If these categories cannot exist, then how can we understand ourselves by them? So the Victorian identity was in trouble philosophically, but it didn't just have these abstract philosophical issues. There were a number of forces within Victorian society that were blurring the categorical distinctions which the Victorians held dear. As already mentioned, Darwinian evolution blurred the boundaries between animal and man. The New Woman and homosexuality threatened the distinctions between male and female. Fears surrounding degeneration and reverse colonization obscured the distinctions between civilized and uncivilized. These forces represent, to Ricoeur's terminology, the discordance that demands admission. And these are the very conditions under which the monsters begin creeping around the boundaries of our collective identity. Victorian attempts to maintain clear boundaries and to suppress the vagaries introduced by these various forces was becoming untenable. Their identity was built on these clear categories, and these were being challenged everywhere. Bram Stoker's Dracula is the custom-made monster for all this anxiety. He merges and crosses all kinds of the boundaries that the Victorians were desperately trying to hold on to. Let's talk about these boundaries one by one. Victorian society was taking the idea of the supernatural less and less seriously. A clear boundary was established between the natural and the supernatural, and then the supernatural was disregarded, or it was moved so far away that it was no longer relevant. The world had become disenchanted. The fairies and the angels were all replaced with impersonal forces and cause and effect processes. The world of the novel Dracula is enchanted. Early on, we begin to see the inexplicable incursions of the supernatural. It all starts with Jonathan Harker, a young lawyer on his way to meet a client in the Carpathian Mountains. As a representative of the Victorian middle class traveling in the East, his journal entries read very much like a travel narrative, which was a popular genre in Victorian England. But as he penetrates deeper into the mountains, fantastic elements impose themselves into Harker's narrative. The howling of dogs turns into the howling of wolves. The wind increases and becomes colder, and then he sees, far off in the woods, a faint flickering blue flame. Once he is a guest in the Count's castle, the real fun begins. If there is no such thing as the supernatural, then there is no such thing as demonic possession. Psychological disorder may be, but possession implies an enchanted world. But what happens to Jonathan Harker? During his encounter with the 3 female vampires, his will was not his own. He was unable to do anything but lay quiet in an agony of delightful anticipation. Later in the story, we see the same vulnerability in Lucy. She, too, passively allows Dracula to appropriate her body. Again, in Mina Harker's case, she is forced to drink the blood of Dracula, and the vampire's blood in her veins is also a form of possession. Mina herself tells Van Helsing, "I know that when the Count wills me, I must go. I know that if he tells me to come in secret, I must by wile." Mina is essentially warning the men to distrust anything she says or does, for her will and her reason are no longer her own. Harker's declaration that the old centuries had and have powers of their own which mere modernity cannot kill is an admission of the presence of the supernatural. In the world of the novel, it's not just the vampires that have supernatural powers. Some objects are not just objects. They can have qualities or powers that can have an effect on their environment or the people in it. The rationalist believes that the meaning of an object exists in the mind of the subject, but in the enchanted world, the meaning of an object exists quite independently of a human mind. The novel is full of all kinds of the latest Victorian gizmos. Bicycles, phonographs, the portable typewriters. These modern objects are technologically advanced and their meaning is solely an attribution of the human subject. However, with the incursion of Dracula into the modern world, some objects, usually those associated with medieval Christianity, carry meaning and power of their own. The characters come to see that such things as crosses, missals, holy wafers, rosary beads are essential tools of self-defense. And garlic. Let's not forget the garlic. Jonathan Harker is caught between the modern understanding of an object and the medieval when he tries to come to terms with the crucifix. He wonders whether there is something in the essence of the thing itself, or whether it is a medium, a tangible help in conveying memories of sympathy and comfort. In essence, he is wondering if the crucifix is a mere object, upon which subjective emotion is placed, or whether it is an object with its own intrinsic power. Although the modern characters are resistant to this idea, in the world of the novel it is clearly the latter. In Dracula, the modern characters encounter an enchanted world where the boundary between natural and supernatural is blurred. This is but the first boundary to fall, for in the character of Dracula himself they encountered the collapse of even more boundaries, like the one between rational and non-rational. The first part of Dracula dramatizes the gradual breakdown of rational explanation before inexplicable mystery. As revealed in his journal, Harker constantly tries to make sense of some very strange things. His journal is a tool for him to hold on to reason as it threatens to slip away. But he's having a hard time doing this. He says he felt impotent. This is an impotence of the intellect, created by the fear that his conception of reality is no longer rationally founded. Harker's real fear is that his journal, rather than being a reliable account of what he has done and experienced, is actual evidence of his insanity. When he hears Van Helsing's confirmation that his encounters with the supernatural actually occurred, Harker says that it seems to have made a new man of him. Once he knows he's not insane, he regains his manhood. In the journals of Seward and Mina, we also see that reason is gradually eroded by unreason as they must face the irrational, which Dracula represents. Van Helsing states clearly the inadequacy of science alone to understand the world when he says, "It is the fault of our science that it wants to explain all. And if it explains not, then it says there is nothing to explain." In essence, he acknowledges the validity of accepting a supernatural explanation in some instances. Dracula forces the Victorian characters to accept an enchanted reality. Here's another dichotomy the vampire challenges, the one between sane and insane. At the time Dracula was written, people were a little uptight about what they called madness, and these fears are also embodied in the vampire. First, at one time or another, Dracula seems to engender irrational or even hysterical behavior in all the male characters. In Victorian society, this sort of thing was thought to be the provenance only of women. And then there are the parallels between Dracula's vampirism and Renfield's zoophagy, which links the Count with madness. Within Stoker's fictive world, there's no doubt that vampires exist, but Dr. Seward is resistant to their existence. He comes to believe in them in part by observing and identifying with his patient Renfield, who feeds on flies and spiders. You see Dr. Seward's conundrum. If he believes in vampires, he's believing in the unbelievable, which would make him mad. In other words, if Dracula is real, then Renfield is just as sane as he is. The truth of the existence of vampires that each character is forced to accept blurs the boundaries between sanity and insanity. Let's review. The Victorians valued clean-cut categories. These categories were built on reason, and the vampires challenged reason itself by blurring the lines between reason and non-reason, between reason and insanity. And then Dracula blurs the gender and the sexual roles of Victorian society. The distinction between male and female was a crucial distinction in the late 19th century. There was a vast gulf between men and women in Victorian society, and these distinctions increased as you went up the social classes. There were profound differences in legal status, as well as appearance and behavior. If you ever watch TV shows or movies set in this era, you know what I'm talking about. They are practically different species. A woman was assigned the roles of maid, then wife, then mother, and the greatest of these is mother. It was part of her nature to be thus, and whether in the role of maid, wife, or mother, she was expected to live up to a very simple but impossible ideal. We see this in Mina's case. Listen to Van Helsing's description of her. "She is one of God's women, fashioned by his own hand to show us men and other women that there is a heaven that we can enter, and that its light can be here on earth." The new woman was further blurring gender roles. They wanted man things like the vote, higher education, more access to the learned professions, and were ever more frequently working outside the home for money. These anxieties are also embodied in Stoker's monster. For the Victorian, female sexuality had only one legitimate function: making babies within the bounds of marriage. Not only does Dracula corrupt women, he does so by blurring the boundaries of gender and by the transgression of Victorian sexual norms. First, natural sex has a series of distinct acts involving sexual partners that result in offspring. But with vampires, all these actions and the act of feeding is combined into one act where wives become daughters. Dracula represents the fluidity of gender roles where the distinctions between masculinity and femininity are blurred. Jonathan Harker is the damsel in distress in the beginning of the book. Harker's experience shows that female vampires are sexually aggressive. And female vampires are sexual predators who eat children rather than nurture them. Anxiety about gender roles is embodied in the monsters. And like other 19th century monsters, Dracula transgresses the boundary between human and animal, which we said before is the boundary challenged by Darwinian evolution. There is a great deal of animal imagery associated with Dracula, making him the embodiment of that blurred line between man and animal. Jonathan Harker witnesses Dracula crawl down the castle wall, face down with his cloak spreading out around him like great wings. Dracula arrives in England in what people understand to be a large dog. At night he turns into a wolf. He's compared to a tiger, a man-eater, and he never ceased to prowl. He has an aquiline nose with great nostrils. He has very massive eyebrows almost meeting over the nose, and bushy hair that seemed to curl in low profusion. His actions and movements are panther-like, so unhuman, and as he flees his hunters, a horrible sort of snarl passes over his face, showing the eye-teeth long and pointed, but the evil smile as quickly passes into a cold stare of lion-like disdain. This is but a small portion of the animal imagery used to describe the vampire. These images place him in the gap between man and animal. Victorians place themselves in the clear category of the civilized. But this distinction was being challenged at the end of the 19th century. Victorians were obsessed with the idea of degeneration. It was the idea that things could devolve, just like they could evolve. Degeneration is a thing in Count Dracula. The lofty heights from which Dracula has degenerated are provided by Van Helsing. He describes Dracula as he once was, a most wonderful man, soldier, statesman, and alchemist, which later was the highest development of science knowledge of his time. There was no branch of knowledge of his time that he did not essay. Yet he has degenerated into a beast. The fear of degeneration is also linked to the idea of imperial decline and reverse colonization. Just as empires get stronger and expand, history shows that they also decline. The Victorians were mindful of this, and they nervously looked for and worried about it happening to their civilization. Related to this is the fear of reverse colonization, that the civilized world is in danger of being colonized by the primitive peoples. This is a problem in that the only way to differentiate between us and them is if they stay there. In reverse colonization, they come here. This is apparent in the novel. The Count's incursion into London, the heart of the empire, is in effect an invasion, and his lust for blood points not only to the vampire's need for food, but also the warrior's desire for conquest. Dracula has acquired several residences in the London area. In the Count's study, Harker finds a map of England with rings marked on it that identify their locations. In each, boxes of Transylvanian soil, enriched by the blood of men, patriots, or invaders, have been cached. This imported earth is a literal representation that the very soil of England is under threat. Thus, Dracula does not represent simply the threat of immigration, but of military invasion. The Count, through his importation of earth, once again blurs the boundaries between that which is England and that which is not. But the Empire strikes back. The Victorians had faith in reason and science, so Van Helsing and his crew of light used the methods of science to overthrow the vampire monster. Van Helsing and Seward are the representatives of the best scientists of the day. The methodology employed by these two and Mina was in large part one of collecting, collating, and interpreting information. Using these methods, they could deduce where the Count was, what he was up to, both now and in the future, his strengths and his weaknesses, and his mental character. Typically modern, they figured if they could cram all this enchanted otherworldliness into this rational scientific cage, then they could defeat him and eliminate the threat that he represents to the empire of reason. In a sense, the Count is defeated by middle-class office management principles and technology. They use cameras and telegrams and trains and subways and steam-powered boats and blood transfusions and light bulbs. Basically, modern technology and the methodologies of science reestablishes the clarity of the boundaries that the vampire blurred. Problem solved. The most significant battles in the war against Dracula were fought over the two women, Lucy and Mina. The end of this war reestablishes some clarity around gender. The battle over Lucy is between two masculine forces, one considered by Victorian society as good and the other as evil. Dracula is the evil. He exploits Lucy for personal gain, obviously against her consent. Van Helsing's crew of light protects and rescues her, or tries to. This is a battle of blood, where Dracula takes blood from Lucy. Van Helsing presides over the transfusion of blood into Lucy. Initially, Dracula wins the battle for Lucy, and then he turns her into the antithesis of Victorian femininity. She's sexually aggressive and cannibalizes rather than nurtures children. Although Van Helsing's team loses the battle for Lucy, they win the war for femininity. When the transfusion fails, a stake is required, and this succeeds in restoring the Victorian ideal of womanhood. In the destruction of Dracula, the Victorian middle class is the victor. The vampire killers are middle class. The crew of light is established around a table after all the materials have been transcribed and put in good order. This alliance of heroes is cast in a decidedly unheroic fashion when they function like a committee. In its successful campaign against the vampire, the committee establishes the superiority of the Victorian middle class and its traditions over that which threatens it. With Dracula's death, Victorian concerns with degeneration and reverse colonization have been placated, as the supposed superiority of the rational West over the mysterious East is symbolically shown in the Englishman's victory over Dracula. It was a victory of us over them. Dracula has played his role, however, for in order to eliminate Dracula, the modern heroes have suspended the code of reason and adopted methods of unreason. Although they appear to look and behave like proper Englishmen and women, they can't always hold on to this modern code. The crew of light can only overcome the vampire by adopting at least some monstrous and/or enchanted characteristics. For instance, our heroes did break into private property and murder the occupants on occasion, and they did it all very secretly so that no one will ever know. And consider the restorative activities of our heroes in the mutilation of Lucy's body. It is of course rationally necessary to exterminate the monstrous vampire that was once Lucy for the sake of her eternal soul and for the sake of society. However, this scene is pretty gruesome and kinda sketchy morally and sexually. In his diary, Seward describes the event. Arthur placed the point over the heart, and as I looked I could see its dint in the white flesh. Then he struck with all his might. The thing in the coffin writhed, and a hideous blood-curdling screech came from the opened red lips. The body shook and quivered and twisted in wild contortions. The sharp white teeth clamped together till the lips were cut, and the mouth was smeared with crimson foam. But Arthur never faltered. He looked like a figure of Thor as his untrembling arm rose and fell, driving deeper and deeper the mercy-bearing stake, whilst the blood from the pierced heart welled and spurted up all around. Wow. In the pursuit and dispatch of their quarry, these representatives of propriety, decorum, and good order were engaged in behaviors that some might consider unbecoming. They were ruthless hunters and ferocious in their battle to exterminate the vampire, and it was all a little uncivilized, wasn't it? You might ask, is this any different than the British soldier in any war that they've ever fought? It's true. The blending of blood and gut savagery under the veneer of civilized propriety is kind of a British thing. And this might be why they have so many monsters that embody just this sort of thing. They might be having some trouble reconciling it all. So the monster played its role in the end, by revealing, demanding even, that the Victorian audience face what lies beneath the veneer of decorum and propriety and beneath the mask of reason. Look how this theme is resolved in the final presentment of the representative Victorian family. In the final note written by Harker 7 years later, he announces the birth of his son Quincy Harker, who has been born 7 years after to the day of Quincy's death at the slaying of Dracula. He reports Mina's secret wish that some part of Quincy's spirit entered the child. Perhaps this is so, but besides the spirit of Quincy and the blood of his parents, what other blood and spirit may have entered the child? The young Quincy was conceived after Mina was forced to drink the blood of the vampire. Not only did the spirit of the American hero Quincy Morris enter the baby as Mina conceives, but the blood of Dracula did as well. In this, all the categorical transgression that Dracula represents was literally incorporated into that tiny representative of modernity's future. Victorian society held fast to a vision of the world of clear boundaries. But these boundaries were getting difficult to maintain in the face of all these social and intellectual challenges. In Stoker's creation, Dracula, we find the embodiment of Victorian anxiety over the transgression of the boundaries between natural and supernatural, male and female, man and animal, and civilized savage. In his challenge of this order, Dracula represents a challenge to the collective identity of the English middle class in and around 1900. The countervailing of the Victorian order is only temporary. But in Dracula, Stoker shows that the enchanted world can't forever be suppressed. Even though the vampire is vanquished, in his role of monster he functions as a renewing agent for the modernism of the late 19th century. The world that was created and was terrorized by Count Dracula was about to enter a century that would challenge, with real events, our most fundamental notions about ourselves. And all these challenges would create an entirely new monster. The zombie will take up where the vampire left off. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.